I want to begin first by thanking the organizers. Can everyone at the back hear me? Yeah? Okay. I want to thank the organizers and commend them. I think that having this kind of discussion and this kind of conversation among activists from the Iranian community, from the progressive social movements in Toronto and so on, is an extremely important process for all of us. My remarks are going to focus really on the question of power and empire in the world today and how we understand some of the current configurations in the so-called Middle East and the Middle East and North Africa. And I want to begin there because it seems to me that even left criticism, when it's dealing with global political issues, often falls into the trap of using the same terminology and language, the same concepts as the mainstream, but then just trying to draw different conclusions. And I think that's inadequate for our purposes. If we're going to talk about power in the modern world, then we have to begin by talking about the fact that power is defined by accumulation, by the accumulation of capital. And that has been the case since Britain, the first capitalist power in the world, in the 17th century, established its global domination. Now, this may seem obvious, but it's amazing how frequently this starting point is lost in so many analyses. When we talk about so-called geopolitics, therefore, the geographical organization of power on a world scale, we are first and foremost talking about the structure of global capitalism, where its centers of accumulation are, and where those centers of accumulation are, there we find as well the states that dominate the world politically and militarily because of the economic power on which they rest. The second point I want to make in this regard is that the era of capitalist power is the first era of world power and world history. With the rise of capitalism, we get truly global politics. It's why it's the 20th century that gives us world wars for the first time, and this remains a defining feature of our age. All politics today is global, no matter how local it may seem. The next point, which I think is decisive here, is that it follows that nation states are not the starting point for understanding global power and global politics. Most of so-called geopolitical analysis starts from the relationship among nation states. On the contrary, if what I say is correct, that power today rests on capital and its accumulation, then classes, social classes, who produces the wealth, who appropriates it, who uses their appropriation of wealth to build machineries of power, has to be the starting point. And then nations get mapped into an understanding of a world which is defined much more primarily and much more fundamentally by classes and class relationships. That is, I think, a key point for us. Then when we move to the level of nations, that's where we begin to draw out the uneven, hierarchical, and imperial dimensions of power. Because if it's true that power is defined geographically by where the concentrations of capital are in the world, well, we know that those are enormously unevenly distributed, and therefore that certain nation states and their allies operate as imperial powers within the world system. This is not necessarily about a single nation state. It's often a complex of nation states working with a chain of command. Some are senior partners, some are junior partners within the global structure of imperial power. So that, for instance, Canada operates as a mid-range imperial power within that structure, where it has a certain independence, but not total independence from the US empire. But all of that is extremely important because when it comes then to the question of anti-imperialist politics, it allows us, this analysis, I believe, to avoid a very easy mistake which is often made on the left. Because it follows that anti-imperialist politics means opposition to imperialism as a system. And therefore, it has to be a politics which strengthens those social groups who are oppressed within the structure of world capitalism. It doesn't follow, therefore, that simply to be against an imperialist nation state and its leadership is anti-imperialist. It doesn't necessarily follow. There can be regimes in the world that are in conflict, say, with the United States, and it doesn't make them anti-imperialist. They are only anti-imperialist if their policies and practices are building the popular power of those social groups who have an interest and a capacity to transform the system away from being one of global capitalism. And needless to say, I think that's extremely important for all of our analysis of global politics and imperialism in the Middle East and in the Middle East and North Africa today. This then brings me to a few remarks about some of the changing relationships of imperial power today. Because one of the things we need to remember is that social relationships are always historical and therefore always historically dynamic and evolving. Too often on the left, it seems to me, we take an analysis that fit the world at a particular historical moment and we treat it as an unchanging description of the world. So we take an analysis that fit the First World War, for instance. And we assume that in the past 100 years, since 1914, nothing has changed in the way that global power is exercised. And in fact, I want to suggest that the relationship between military, economic, and political domination that is part of imperialism today has been reconfigured in the neoliberal period. And what I mean by that is that economic mechanisms have taken on a renewed power in terms of domination in the neoliberal period. In other words, yes, by all means, military power is always there, and the dominant powers in the world are always willing to resort to it as necessary. But it is not always their preferred course of action. And where it is possible to use economic mechanisms to subordinate or resubordinate regions of the world, they are quite happy to move in that direction. And I think we need to understand the way in which during the neoliberal period, trade agreements, global financial institutions, and so on have operated as a key front for the establishment of global hegemony and global domination. So that, the analysis which said prior to 1978, American imperial power in the Middle East rested on its client relationships with Israel, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, I think that was correct. But to think that we can only use that framework to understand how things are operating today, I think is inadequate. To be sure, Israel remains front and center. But it's no longer just Saudi Arabia. It's now become the Gulf Cooperation Council, integrated through its own free trade agreements, which are then integrated through free trade agreements with the United States, the European Union, and so on. And then there is the way in which a whole variety of other nation states, through these free trade agreements, have become increasingly integrated into empire. So that I'm thinking particularly of the kinds of agreements that have brought states like Jordan, Egypt, Morocco, and so on, so much into the orbit of American and European power, largely through a whole variety of mechanisms, not only the free trade agreements, but the so-called qualified industrial zone agreements. And this is extremely important in terms of something that Tom was talking about, because every one of these qualified industrial zone agreements, which means Egypt, Jordan, whoever, creates a free trade zone with the United States. Every one of these agreements requires free trade between those nation states and Israel. They can only have these deals if a certain amount of the inputs into all of their products are coming from Israel. So that, in other words, there's this very clever mechanism and system by which the Israeli economy, integrated into the US economy, is being moved into a position of ever greater domination regionally as part of this structure. So I emphasize that, and by the way, I still think that the best treatment of all of this, for those of you who are interested, because I'm drawing extensively here on what I consider the really illuminating analysis of Adam Hania in his book Lineages of Revolt, where he traces through these processes of neoliberal imperialism today. All of this, I think, helps us to understand some of the trial directions that are being developed between Iran and the United States today. They are testing, and Rouhani's speech at Davos at the World Economic Forum this week was one opportunity for the Islamic Republic of Iran to position itself as open to neoliberal integration, for instance. A very, very important signal being given to the Obama administration in Rouhani's speech, I believe, in Davos earlier this week. With all of that in mind, I really want to just suggest a few things as by way of conclusion in terms of some of the elements that I think have to be essential to building left and popular solidarity against imperialism in the context of the current moment. One of them, obviously, must be opposition to the sanctions against Iran. These are sanctions which punish the Iranian people. That, I think, has to be front and center. Secondly, has to be opposition to all imperial war threats against Iran and its population. To imagine that Iran's nuclear program is going to be singled out when the Israeli nuclear program isn't just a program. They've got a stockpile of weapons is obscene. Thirdly, though, I think opposition to neoliberalism and austerity has to be central to any such solidarity politics. Fourthly, I think that we need to get much more serious, and I know that some of the organizations in the labor movement, and Farid is part of this with CUPE, are very important here. To begin the work of building whatever grassroots connections are possible with social movements here and social movements in Iran and in the Middle East more generally, with workers' organizations, women's organizations, student groups, and so on, to actually begin that process of grassroots solidarity from below, rather than this idea that we simply have to choose what nation state we are defending. And then finally, the point that Tom also finished on, solidarity with the Palestinian struggle for self-determination has to be an integral part of all of that. But it seems to me that those 6 elements, following from the analysis that I was trying to develop, are really indispensable for the kind of work that I think we're talking about today when we talk about the development of new kinds of solidarities in this particular moment of neoliberalism and imperialism. Thank you.
Thank you.